Hello and welcome to Book Sandwiched In. We're in the New Haven Free Public Library here in New Haven, Connecticut. My name is Isaac Shub, and we're joined now by our guest, Professor Noam Chomsky, who's in Arizona. So welcome, Professor Chomsky.
Glad to be here.
We are incredibly grateful to have you here this evening for this special edition in the series of author talks. And I should just note to everyone else that Noam Chomsky is, just by the evidence, an incredibly devoted person, devoted to service, and has been doing tons of these talks and has been busy all day with these talks. So we'll try to keep you entertained. If you'd like to change the subject and need to, please feel free to do so. There are a lot of people at this event. And there are likely a lot of people streaming on Facebook, so I anticipate a lot of questions, and we'll try to get to those that we can in the time that we have. Professor Chomsky really needs no introduction, but for those who are unfamiliar, he's widely considered the founder of modern linguistics. His contributions in that field have influenced developments in philosophy, cognitive science, computer science, psychology, and beyond. He is among the most cited scholars in modern history, and he has also written widely on politics and became known in the 60s for protesting the Vietnam War, beginning most prominently with his essay in the New York Review of Books in 1967 titled "The Responsibility of Intellectuals." His political work has challenged the often unspoken assumptions driving American political commentary. Chomsky is professor emeritus at MIT, where he taught for over 50 years. And since the fall of 2017, he has been laureate professor in the Department of Linguistics at the University of Arizona. So this program is called Book Sandwiched In. It's usually during lunch, so it's usually a kind of book sandwiched in during lunch kind of talk. And the main impetus for the talk was your recent book with Marv Waterstone, Consequences of Capitalism. So before we get into that, I just briefly want to ask you about language. When you were interviewed by the New York Times in 1979, and I hope they quoted you accurately. You were asked whether there's a link between your scientific and political work, and you were quoted as saying there's no direct connection between them, but that perhaps in some measure they derive from certain basic assumptions and attitudes with regard to human nature. Can you expand on what those beliefs are about human nature and its potential, and how you see those qualities indicated in the human capacity for language?
Well, there's actually classic discussion of this. So the crucial issue of the crucial element of human language, its most salient element, which was already discussed by Galileo and other great scientists in the 17th century and since, is that language has an inherently creative aspect. Our language capacity enables us to construct infinitely many new thoughts in our minds, and even to convey to others who have no access to our minds what are their innermost workings. Galileo and his contemporaries, many successors, regarded this as one of the most amazing facts about the world altogether. Actually, Galileo regarded the alphabet as the most stupendous human achievement because it was able to record this astonishing process. I think that's right. The use of language is normally creative, innovative, evoking new thoughts. In Cartesian terms, we're incited and inclined to talk in certain ways, but not compelled. The innovation, the creativity comes from this. Well, this was linked plausibly to a conception of human freedom, that a fundamental classical liberalism was based on around the same period, some of the same people, like Wilhelm von Humboldt, was based on the assumption that any external infringement on a person's right to the free exercise of his or her abilities is intolerable. In fact, that was the basis for the strong, bitter opposition of the working class in the early Industrial Revolution to the attack on human dignity imposed by wage labor, which they called wage slavery, same conception. So there's that kind of link. It's not a logical link, but it's a link in a kind of conception of the core of human nature.
So for the last several years, you've taught this class at the University of Arizona with geographer Marv Waterstone, and the lectures for that class were compiled for the book that I have behind me that hopefully the audience can see, Consequences of Capitalism, Manufacturing, Discontent, and Resistance, published by Haymarket. So the book starts with a discussion of Gramsci's concept of hegemonic common sense and David Hume's observation, which you note that nothing is more surprising, quote, than the easiness with which the many are governed by the few, and the implicit submission with which men resign their own sentiments and passions to those of their rulers, unquote. And you say, you know, this is the case just as much in dictatorships led by force as in countries like the US, where the ability to use force to suppress dissent is relatively limited. In the US, consent has to be engineered, in the words of Edward Bernays. I thought it was also telling you included the 17th century philosopher John Locke, who said, the greatest part cannot know, and therefore they must believe. So I know you've talked about this countless times over the years, but can you give us maybe an example or two of this engineering of consent, maybe its history, if you like, and how it functions? And I'm curious how you see hegemonic common sense in operation today.
Well, let's take a look at 9/11, the anniversary of 9/11, coinciding with the anniversary of the invasion of Afghanistan, then Iraq. Ton of commentary about it, of course. Lots of discussion about 20 years and so on. Well, it's pretty obvious that the most important interview that could be presented on the 20th anniversary would be with the person who called himself the decider and was the decider, the person who initiated the war in Afghanistan, quickly transited to the war in Iraq, both devastating for the countries involved and so on. Obvious, isn't it? Well, I managed to ferret out one interview with George W. Bush. It was in the Washington Post, major newspaper, in the style section. It was a story about it was on the 20th anniversary, and it described this lovable, goofy grandpa who has fun with his children and looks at all the portraits he painted of the great men he knew. And there's a side mention of there were these couple of wars, but at least he's not as bad as Trump, who called his opponents evil, and Bush never did that. So it wasn't too bad. A couple million people killed, millions of refugees, 2 countries destroyed, ethnic conflicts elicited that spread over the whole region, but he didn't call his opponents evil. So that takes care of the decider. Well, that's, in a way, that encapsulates the nature of the flood of commentary. Ton of material about the cost to us. You know, trillions of dollars spent, American lives lost, what was achieved. There's some side mention that other people didn't do too well either, but that sets up a framework for thinking. And in fact, it's pursued. It's not the first time. The United States didn't invent it. When the British were running the world, they handled it the same way.
There are a few people who are saying if you could speak closer to the microphone, that would be helpful.
Okay.
But I can hear you. You've already covered a lot of things that I wanted to ask about. But one of the questions that I was getting a lot leading up to, questions that people had for you was about the U.S. departure from Afghanistan. Many in the media who didn't seem to comment a lot about what was happening in Afghanistan over the last few years were really upset and frustrated by the departure and by the leaving of U.S. soldiers, and paid a lot of attention to it. And it seemed like it merited attention. But is that the kind of case of certain attention is being paid to an event when it's kind of convenient? Are you surprised that that Biden actually went through with withdrawing U.S. soldiers?
Well, that's a very interesting story. Now, right now, there's a closed Senate hearing on the withdrawal in which the Republican Party is lambasting Biden for one of the worst tragedies in history, which gets reported, but some things missed. President Trump in February 2020 totally betrayed the Afghan people and the Afghan government, made a private arrangement, didn't even invite any Afghans, made an arrangement to withdraw in May of 2021, worst possible time, right at the start of the fighting season, and to do it with no conditions. Taliban could do anything they like, just not shoot at American soldiers, because that wouldn't look good for him. That was his agreement. Republican Party en masse praised him for this historic achievement, magnificent achievement. Actually, that remained on their webpage up until the actual effects of the withdrawal were shown. What Biden, and then of course they took it off their webpage. Since then, they've been denouncing Biden for actually improving on what Trump, the hideous betrayal of Trump's that they were praising, by delaying it a couple of months and bringing in Afghans. And now just follow the Senate proceedings. One after another is getting up. He has to be impeached. A horrible atrocity. How could anybody do this? I mean, there's no word, you can't call it hypocrisy. That isn't anywhere near strong enough. I mean, it's so beyond shameful that you can't even find a word to describe it. And you can say the same about the media. I mean, they're condemning it too. Did they condemn the worst proposal? Oh, nothing. In fact, the whole idea that this was a surprise is ridiculous. I can, if you want, send you back to videos I had a couple of months earlier predicting the obvious. As soon as the US withdraws, the Afghan government, which is just a morass of corruption, will disappear, probably taking most of the funds with them. The Afghan army, which is mostly on paper, others who haven't been paid, others who don't want to fight for a foreign power, will collapse, of course. I mean, anybody who wasn't burdened by intelligence information could see this. And I mean burdened by it. If you look at the way intelligence is created, we have plenty of evidence of this from Vietnam and other places. The people on the ground know what's going on, and they give accurate reports. They give them to people up a little higher in the chain of command, gets modified into what they want to hear, and the next guy wants to hear. By the time it gets to the top, it may have no relation to what's happening. We've seen this over and over. But if you're not burdened by this system, and you just look at the obvious facts, which It's not hard to find. Of course, this is going to happen. It's a duplicate of what happened in Iraq. The US created this huge army, hundreds of thousands of people, heavily armed, a couple of hundred jihadis waving rifles came towards them in pickup trucks. The officers ran away, the troops ran away, left their weapons on the ground. The Taliban, who were marching into Kabul, if you look at the photos, are armed, or look like special forces from NATO. Why? Because they have all the US equipment. They themselves had rifles and sneakers. Happens over and over for pretty obvious political reasons. I mean, if you were occupied by a foreign power and driven into the army and told to fight kill your fellow citizens because the foreign power wants you to do, is that what you would do?
It is quite striking, and it can be enough to make a person question his or her sanity, because hearing that the Taliban was coming very close to retaking the country, seeing that people were surprised was really hard to wrap my head around, because I'm not a military expert. I don't spend a lot of time studying these, intelligence reports. I don't have access to them, and I don't spend a huge amount of time even following the news. But just from reading the New York Times, occasionally you could tell the Taliban was making. They had been, it seemed like, capturing cities throughout the past 6 to 12 months. So then to hear John Kirby, say a few days before the Taliban takeover that the Afghan army could hold out if they just tried hard. It was hard to know. Was he being is he being serious?
Why doesn't he pick up a rifle and go there and help him out? Why should they fight for him?
Yeah. So in the context of kind of trying to cut through distractions and better understand the truth, I wanted to ask you, to return to someone you've mentioned, and that's Donald Trump and the Republican Party that he's kind of taken over in large part, and also the January 6th insurrection. And so that Washington Post article that you pointed out about the interview with Bush was very interesting, because it said basically Bush may have invaded Iraq on false pretenses, but at least he didn't inspire an insurrection. As you said, at least he didn't call his domestic adversaries evil. So you talk in the book Consequences of Capitalism about Robert Jackson, the U.S. prosecutor at Nuremberg, and his reference to the metaphoric poison chalice being handed to the defendants. And you explained, if we sip from this, we're guilty of similar crimes. We have to suffer the same fate. Otherwise, we should concede the judicial proceeding is a farce. This is victor's justice. So I guess I'm just kind of wondering if you can help establish some continuity in the historical narrative. What brings us from 9/11 to January 6th to the present and going forward?
Well, let's start with Robert Jackson, chief prosecutor at Nuremberg. What you quoted was his address to the tribunal, saying, as you said, we're handing these defendants a poison chalice. If we sip from it, we must suffer the same fate. Crucial element in Nuremberg was what they called the supreme international crime, differing from other war crimes in that it includes all of the consequences that follow. That's aggression, a crime of aggression. There is a treaty called the United Nations Charter, which is the basis for international law. It bars the threat or use of force in international affairs, except under conditions that apply. There is something called the US Constitution, which everybody is supposed to worship, especially if you're on the right, carry it around in your pocket, you love it, and so on. Well, if anybody bothers to read it, Article 6 says that treaties entered into by the United States government are the supreme law of the land, and anyone who violates them has to be brought to justice. Well, there's a treaty, the UN Charter, the major treaty. Every US president violates it. Some violate it extremely. Remember, it says threat or use of force. Have you ever heard a threat of force from a US president? Okay, how about use of force, like invading Afghanistan and invading Iraq? In brief, George Bush, Dick Cheney, the rest of them, can add Obama, they're all guilty of violating the US Constitution. Did you ever see anybody write about it? Actually, I've occasionally, just for fun, I write about it, but occasionally for fun, I've brought it up at talks at law schools, good law schools, faculty, seminars. People listen, they say, kind of interesting. Let's go on to the next topic. Okay, I'm sure you can find plenty of analogs right where you are. Okay, well, that's what Gramsci called hegemonic common sense. It's just built into us. Yes, we're a gang of criminals. We don't have to pay attention to the Constitution. We can kill anybody we like. I mean, let's go on with that. Suppose that Iran right now was carrying out a global assassination campaign in which the leaders sat down every Tuesday morning, read a little bit of the Islamic equivalent of St. Augustine and Just War, and then judiciously decided who they're going to assassinate today. Namely, of the many people around the world who they consider might be a threat to them, which ones should we assassinate today? How would the Australian press react to that? How do they react when it actually happens? During the Obama administration, it's exactly what was described. Obama, Brennan, sat down Tuesday morning, read a chapter from St. Augustine, pondered the question, who should we murder today? And one of the people who we think might turn out to be a threat to us, maybe some collateral damage if people happen to be standing across the street. That's called drone warfare. Okay, just goes on. It's our right. We have the right to be criminals, murderers, do whatever we like because we say we're good. In fact, it's interesting to look at the commentary on the Iraq War or the Afghan War. Take Iraq. There are people who are greatly honored for having opposed the Iraq War, like Barack Obama, most prominent of them, who described the war as a strategic blunder. Well, I think we've heard that phrase before. Go back to Nazi Germany. There are plenty of top generals who said it's a strategic blunder to carry out Operation Barbarossa to invade the East, two-front war, ought to knock England out first. Do we honor them as great heroes? No. If we have, I haven't seen it. In fact, we regard it as criminal. That's them. This is us. Let's take the invasion of Afghanistan. Everyone is supposed to have loved that. In fact, global opinion was mostly against it, but what do they know? It's the Anglosphere was in favor of it. United States, England, Australia, that's what matters. They had no international authorization, plain crime of aggression. What did the Afghans think about it? Kind of an interesting question. We have evidence about it. There was an anti-Taliban Afghan resistance with some very famous and honored figures leading it, like Abdul Haq, later murdered by the Taliban. He bitterly condemned the invasion. He said the Americans just want to kill a lot of Afghans. It's going to undermine our efforts, which are succeeding to overthrow the government from within. The Americans are doing it because they want to show their muscle and intimidate everyone. He was backed by a meeting of 1,000 tribal elders, got together, issued a declaration pretty similar to this by the main women's group. We're supposed to be concerned about Afghan women. Rawa, major women's group, issued a similar declaration saying, yes, we want to overthrow the Taliban, but it's the responsibility of the Afghan people, not invaders from the outside. Did this bother anyone? Has it even been reported? Well, actually, if you look closely, there's a little bit of reporting. There was the interview with Abdul Haq actually was reported in The Guardian, London, but it has no effect. They don't count. They're what sometimes been called unpeople, not real people, just people that are in the way.
It is striking the consistency with which the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, the U.S. wars there, are referred to as disasters or mistakes, fundamental errors, rather than great immoralities.
There is a word called crime, supreme international crime. That's part of the poison chalice. Nothing that the US or Britain or Australia does can be called a crime. Maybe it can be a mistake. In our innocence, we didn't understand something. Couldn't be a crime. The crimes are for others.
So you've talked a lot in recent years about two very major threats to the survival of the human species in its present form: global warming and nuclear weapons. I also saw a recent interview with you where you referred to a third, what the WHO and some others have called an infodemic. So especially since the election of Trump and with the decline of print media, there's been more discussion about the spread of misinformation, bad information, propaganda, fake news. So this is something I guess I'm wondering, since it's something you spent a lot of your career on, can you talk about where you see what you see the sources of this infodemic being?
The infodemic is worse than dissemination of inaccurate news. There has actually been a virtual collapse of the environment for rational discussion, not over the whole society, but substantially. There's just no arena of rational discourse on almost anything. Take the COVID epidemic, very serious. It's not as bad as what you just mentioned. It's not as bad as heating the environment, nuclear weapons, but it's pretty severe. The latest estimate of deaths by London economists, careful estimate, says it's probably around 15 million people and increasing. It's not trivial. The United States just passed the 500,000 mark. Well, it's actually higher. That's the counted deaths. Actual ones are a couple 100,000 higher. Take a look every day in the New York Times, probably other newspapers. They publish a map, global map of the global hotspots. Okay? Take a look at it. The United States stands out in the world. There is no other functioning society that's marked red on the map. Now, if you look more closely at the United States, it's not the whole country. It's the Southeast, the old Confederacy during the Civil War, and a couple of other rock-ribbed Republican states, Wyoming, Idaho, and so on. in those states, hospitals are collapsing under the crush of COVID victims, virtually 100% unvaccinated. The same states are subjected to a barrage of claims that COVID was created by China to destroy the United States. The vaccine is invented by state authorities who want to control you, or maybe Bill Gates who wants to put a chip in your head, or Trump fosters this. They worship Trump. I mean, there's no rational discourse. And the gap between, this is incidentally a very large, it's probably the base of the Republican Party. Majority of Republicans say they don't want to be vaccinated. It's just a hoax, you know? Take something more serious, destroying the environment. Major poll just came out from Pew Research, major polling agency, in which they asked people, they gave people a choice of 15 serious problems, asked them to rank them in terms of urgency, divided by Republicans and Democrats. Among Republicans, the very last one at the bottom was global warming. At the top was illegal immigrants and the debt. The debt, incidentally, became a problem last November 4th. Up until then, the debt was fine. Republicans were creating it to enrich very rich people, so it was no problem. November 4th, Biden took it over, might use it to help others, poor people. Terrible, major problem. It's not that the people who said that actually believe it. It's that's what they hear in the bubble in which they're contained. You listen to the Murdoch TV station, Fox News, you read the Murdoch press, that's what you hear. And when you're stuck in that bubble, that's what you believe. So the real problems are illegal immigrants, terrible problem. The debt suddenly became a problem. And at the bottom of the list is destroying the environment in which life can be sustained. All of these are signs of the collapse, not only of the arena for rational discourse, but just general social collapse. The social order is collapsing. It didn't just happen by itself. It happened because of a plague that was set in motion 40 years ago. We discuss a lot of it in the book. It's the plague of neoliberalism. It was actually started in the 70s, a massive business campaign to institute it, but it took off with Reagan and Thatcher. And if you look at their prescriptions, it's perfectly obvious what's going to happen. So Reagan's inaugural address said, the government is the problem, not the solution. Decisions have to be taken out of the hands of government. Well, they don't stop being made. Where are they going to be made? In the private sector. They're going to be made by powerful corporate tyrannies, which is what corporations are, unaccountable to the public. The government, of course, has a flaw. It's partially accountable to the public, can be controlled somewhat by the public. Private tyrannies are free, no accountability. Second point was Milton Friedman, the economic guru, who pronounced that corporations have one responsibility to their owners, state shareholders, period, and management, nothing else. Corporate rights are a gift from the public. There's plenty of advantages that come from incorporating. It's a gift, but they don't have any responsibility, just to themselves. Put these two things together, hand decisions over to private tyrannies who have no responsibility other than to enrich themselves. Margaret Thatcher comes along and says, there's no society, just individuals somehow managing on the market that they're supposed to survive in. First step that both Reagan and Thatcher took was to destroy any possible defense against this assault. Their first steps were to attack labor unions with actually illegal measures like strikebreakers. That opened the door to corporations do the same. The one way people have to defend themselves, namely by organizing, taken away. Put all this together, do you have to be a genius to figure out what's going to happen? Well, actually, 40 years later, it was studied by the Rand Corporation, super respectable American corporation. They tried to estimate the transfer of wealth, robbery, we should call it, the transfer of wealth from the lower 90% of the population, middle class and working class, to the very top, which turns out to be a fraction of 1%. Their estimate was about $50 trillion during the 40 years of neoliberalism. It's a vast underestimate. They didn't include other things, which are now on the front pages. When Reagan came in, he opened the spigot to businesses to do whatever they liked. Tax havens had been illegal before that and blocked by the Treasury Department. Opened it up. It's probably another tens of trillions of dollars. Changed the rules on corporate management, which the government sets, allowing CEOs to be compensated with stock options instead of salaries. That means anything you can do to raise the stock, like buy back stocks, great. May ruin the corporation, but good for you, get a higher income. That's a result. Also, executives were permitted to pick their own board, the board that would determine their salary. What do you think is going to happen? Okay, just take a look at the figures. I mean, CEOs' salaries just skyrocketed, carrying all of top management along with them, extended to the public sector, university presidents, hospital presidents, so on. Meanwhile, majority of the population gets by from payday to payday in a precarious existence. It's a major assault on the population, and it's happened all over the world. Australia, Europe, not as severe as the United States, but severe. Effect of that is people are angry, disillusioned, resentful, very easy prey to demagogues of the Trump variety who says, I'll save you, and just distrust for everything. Why should I believe what the Center for Disease Control says about the pandemic? They're probably just run by crooks in Washington, liberal elites. I don't believe anything they say. So you have a breakdown of the social order. It's happening over much of the world. And it's not hard to trace.
So there is, unfortunately, we are still having some problems, people hearing you. And I'm not sure if the problem is it may be on our end, so I apologize.
Close as I can be.
Thank you. So there's somebody that's asking about wanting to hear your thoughts as they relate to the title of the book, Consequences of Capitalism. What does it mean? And the perennial question, what can be done? And it seems to me that's exactly what you've just been discussing. Is that right?
Well, first of all, there are many different kinds of capitalism. It's a very broad concept. Fact of the matter is that the so-called communist states are capitalist. Soviet Russia, communist China, they're just different variants of state capitalism. As we discuss in the book, in the West, since the Second World War, there have been two periods quite different periods of how the state capitalist system worked. First couple of decades after the Second World War, what was sometimes called regimented capitalism, basically moderately social democratic. In the United States, it's called New Deal. You're not allowed to use the word social in the United States. That's illegal. So it's called New Deal, but it's basically what's called socialist in Europe and most of the rest of the world, banned in the US. And it was a period, the highest growth period in the history of capitalism, egalitarian growth, no financial crises to speak of. Banks were banks, they just served the general public. Taxes on the corporate sector and the wealthy were very high, up to 90%. Very fast and egalitarian growth, plenty of flaws, but it's basically the way it was. By the late 70s, there was a business backlash, tried to destroy this all the way through. Finally, by the late 70s, they were able to make it. Then came along Reagan and Thatcher, and you get the whole radical, so-called libertarian, neoliberal assault. Well, those are two different kinds of capitalism. So for example, during the first phase, the minimum wage tracked productivity. If it stopped in the late 70s, if it had continued, the minimum wage now would be about 3 times as high as it is, but it stopped. Okay, you didn't have roughly 70% of the population living from paycheck to paycheck. You didn't have the top 0.1% doubling its wealth share from 10% to 20%. These are aspects of a different kind of capitalism. So at the very least, we could move towards a moderately beneficial form of capitalism, but it's still capitalism, still based on the principle that certain people are masters who give orders and others are servants or slaves who follow the orders. That's called having a job. Having a job means spending most of your waking hours in a condition of subordination to a master that Stalin never achieved. Stalin couldn't tell you at 3 o'clock you can go to the bathroom for 5 minutes, or here's the clothes you have to wear, or here's the path you have to take from this point in the warehouse to the other point. Now, Stalin couldn't do that. President Xi in China can't do that. But that's the life for most people. That was bitterly opposed for millennia, back to classical Greece and Rome. It was recognized that there's no assault on human rights and dignity harsher than being subordinated to a master. Of course, they excluded slaves, women, poor, and so on, but that was the principle. And that was the guiding principle for working people in the early industrial revolution, right through the 19th century. Well, finally sort of gotten beaten out of their heads. But that's something that's not far below the surface, should be revived. Why should you take orders from a master most of your waking life? There are other ways to organize. Production can be organized by the workers. You can have cooperatives, collectives of various kinds. In fact, working people and farmers in late 19th century America, vast majority of them, wanted to create what they called a cooperative commonwealth, where the people themselves would cooperate to organize work, life, communities without masters. Well, it was crushed by plenty of violence and also by plenty of ideology, doctrine, imposing Gramscian hegemonic common sense. And now it's regarded as a peripheral position, but it can come forth. Well, those are among the consequences of capitalism.
People are, I imagine, usually struck when they hear these kinds of ideas about wage slavery, at least in this country. And I highly recommend to anyone who's listening who's not familiar with it, a talk you gave in 1970 called "Government in the Future," which I found very useful, where you trace a lot of these ideas we're talking about. You kind of given, you demonstrate an exposition of classical liberalism in von Humboldt, and basically make the argument that liberal ideas in their essence, though not in the way they developed, are profoundly anti-capitalist. So in this book, Professor Waterstone speaks a fair amount about Marx, and you do talk about wage slavery. I'm wondering, what aspects of Marx's work do you find useful, and which aspects do you find not so useful?
Well, Marv, my colleague, is much more of a Marx scholar than I am, so I read it, but he's the one who talked about it mostly, so you should ask him. I've preferred to quote classical liberals, people like John Stuart Mill, leading intellectual figure of the 19th century, highly regarded, one of the most honored intellectuals. His view was that in a properly ordered society, there should be no masters and no servants. Production, social life should be organized by the participants in a democratic, participatory fashion. That Abraham Lincoln and the Republican Party are the ones who used the term wage slavery, not Marx. American workers had never heard of Marx when they picked this up. This was the Republican Party, considered it intolerable, except as a temporary measure till you become free. Now, Lincoln and the Republican Party talked about individual freedom till you become individually free. But the working people and farmers in the United States were talking about collective freedom in a cooperative commonwealth, far beyond the Republican Party or even classical liberalism. Well, I think those are ideas that we should resurrect. There's plenty to learn from Marx. For me, the most, at least personally, the most important parts are the historical analyses, which are pretty insightful. And many of the concepts, fundamental concepts like alienated labor, exploitation, and so on, which incidentally were fairly common coin in the late rationalist, early romantic period. People like Humboldt, for example. For Humboldt, just to pick one of his aphorisms, he said, if an artisan creates a beautiful work on command, we may admire what he did, but will despise what he is, namely a tool in the hands of others. And Humboldt's aphorism that nothing is more important than to allow the full flourishing of a person's capacities in every aspect of life. That was taken by Mill as the epigraph from On Liberty, his famous work. So this runs right through our own history, right through our own tradition. I quoted Adam Smith repeatedly, who was anti-capitalist in his fundamental sentiments and perspective. So just take a look at the famous words, invisible hand, which you study in every economics class. Do you study the way he used the term? Well, it's pretty easy to find out. He used it twice in any relevant sense, so not hard to find. Once in Wealth of Nations, once in his other major book, Moral Sentiments. In Wealth of Nations, he's discussing international trade. And he says that the merchants and manufacturers of England might make greater profit if they bought from abroad, sold to abroad, but their commitment to their own country would lead them to prefer to invest and produce and consume at home. So as if by an invisible hand, England would be spared to be anachronistic, what we call neoliberal globalization. That's one use. The other use is in Moral Sentiments, where he discusses kind of a thought experiment. What would happen if it's an agricultural country, if one landlord accrued almost all the land to himself? He said, well, it wouldn't matter too much, because the landlord, because of his concern for others and his desire to be admired by others, would make sure to distribute his property so that everybody would be pretty well off. So as if by an invisible hand, we would get relative justice. Is that what you're taught in economics classes? Is that capitalist ideology? Not exactly. Those are the two uses.
I know, our time here is short, and I certainly don't want to waste it by asking about something that maybe is not all that important. But there's a question submitted by somebody about overpopulation, and I do hear overpopulation written about and discussed occasionally. And a lot of people, some people have asked me personally, do you think it's ethical or moral to have children because of global warming? And my response has always been, well, having children is natural to human beings, and it's important that we find hope in children. Do you have anything a little more studied than that to kind of say about overpopulation? Do you have any thoughts about it?
Well, there's a well-known solution to the problem of overpopulation. Works very well, poor countries and rich countries. It's called education of women. Everywhere where you try education of women, whether in rich countries in Europe, poor countries like the one province of India that's run by the left, Kerala, just poor province, you get a very sharp decline in fertility. If women have choices, understanding, planning, you get lower fertility. Okay? So you want to solve the problem of overpopulation. You don't need force. You just need minimal humanity. Educate women. There's an interesting sideline on this. The right wing claims, I stress claims, to be strongly opposed to abortion. It's a huge issue. Are they opposed to abortion? In fact, they're in favor of abortion, in favor of illegal, harmful abortion. That's the consequence of opposing family planning, contraception, banning legal practices. Effect is more abortion, more danger, more deaths. They're not opposed to abortion. Of course, they're also opposed to child welfare. So what happens to the child after he's born to his family? I mean, in fact, if you look at the abortion issue, rabid in the United States, it's a very interesting history. You go back to the 1970s, the right wing was not opposed to abortion. Ronald Reagan, governor of California, passed one of the most strongest pro-choice legislations in the country. George H.W. Bush, the first Bush, strongly pro-choice. Barry Goldwater, the Republican candidate, same. By the 1980s, same people had all become passionately opposed to abortion. What happened? Moral reawakening? Something very simple. Chief Republican strategists, Paul Weyrich, Richard Viguerie, recognized that if they pretend, I stress pretend, to be anti-abortion, they pick up the evangelical vote, huge vote in the United States, and the Northern Catholic vote. Furthermore, it can be a cover for racism. A lot of this started because Southern racists, when schools had to be opened up, started segregated religious schools with government funding. Well, the court stepped in and said, no, that's in violation of the law. So here's a way to get your segregated racist schools without violating the law. Say, well, we want schools which uphold Christian values, like abortion rights. So we're not racists, except we are, of course. Well, change it that's the change from the 70s to the 80s. One aspect of the neoliberal programs, in fact, an essential aspect. If you're going to get people to accept the neoliberal assault, you have to shift attention away from class and economic issues to what are called cultural issues. Abortion, guns, then you can maybe get people excited,
So since we're just winding down here, I just wanted to ask, I don't know if you have time, but yesterday House Democrats announced this plan to raise taxes by more than $2 trillion, but they did not they don't want to institute a wealth tax that Biden and the Senate had favored. So surprisingly, most Americans seem to favor a wealth tax. But clearly the Democrats are, they're not a monolith, but I'm curious how you assess their performance since Biden's election.
Well, you have to recognize that 50% of the Senate, which is Republican, are rock solid opposed to anything that might help anyone, for very good reasons, strategic reasons. If the Biden administration can do anything positive for the country, he'll get credit for it. And if you want to roar back into power next year and 2025, have to make sure that the country suffers as much as possible. So anything that might help the general population, they're going to block 100%. Now, they've virtually said it in those words. So the question is, what about the other 50%? Well, Republicans have a red line, which they've made very explicit. Nothing in the bill can raise taxes on the wealthy or the corporate sector, period. The one legislative achievement of the Trump administration was a tax scam, which radically reduced taxes on the very wealthy and corporations. And that can't be touched. That's a red line. And a number of the what are called moderate Democrats, meaning right-wing Democrats, go along with that. So you can't touch that. Well, yes, you can't have a wealth tax. You can't have measures which reduce subsidies to the fossil fuel industry. Just think what that means. You read the IPC report that just came out. Can't stop subsidies to the fossil fuel industry. We have to race over the abyss catastrophe in order to ensure more profits to our corporate funders in the next couple of years. Well, put a bunch of these things together. The bill, if any bill passes, probably none, but if any bill passes, it's going to be very watered down.
We do have to wind down, and we have tons of questions, and I think that's I hope I said testament to the interest that your work has generated and continues to generate for people. But I just want to encourage people. Noam Chomsky is out there giving talks all the time, giving interviews and writing papers. So please follow him and follow other people who are speaking out. So I just want to thank you so much again for joining us. And my thanks also to everyone who attended. If you like this talk, you can watch other discussions on the New Haven Free Public Library YouTube page. I hope you'll join us for future programs. And there is a quick survey on your way out about that could help us inform programming at the library. So I'd like to give you the last word. It was great to have you here.